I am Carrie Bourne. I'm from the Office of Continuing Education at UW-Whitewater, and we host the Fairhaven Lecture Series each semester. This semester we're focusing on standing the test of time, the traditions and customs and natural wonders that have stood the test of time. And today we'll be talking about trees with Bruce Allison. Bruce Allison is a consulting arborist with Allison Tree LLC in Verona, with expertise in advanced technologies in non-destructive tree decay detection and tree risk assessment. He is an author, educator, and researcher. In addition to various technical article publications, he has authored award-winning books on tree appreciation, including Wisconsin's Champion Trees from Wisconsin Books in 2005, Every Root and Anchor, Wisconsin's Famous and Historic Trees from Wisconsin Historical Society Press in 2005, and If Trees Could Talk from Wisconsin Historical Society Press in 2009. An adjunct professor in the Forest and Wildlife Ecology Department at UW-Madison, he teaches a class on tree risk assessment and another on sustainable forestry. Since 2005, he has been a research cooperator at the USDA Forest Products Lab, participating in several research projects, co-authoring articles, and advising several visiting international students studying at the lab. His undergraduate degree is from Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, and he received his master's and doctoral degrees from UW-Madison. His academic and professional service includes serving on the International Society of Arboricultural Publications editorial board, the University of Wisconsin Arboretum Board of Visitors, the Wisconsin Council on Forestry, the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources Urban Forestry Council. He has lectured widely across North America, plus Europe, South America, and China. Welcome, Bruce Allison.
Carrie, thank you very, very much. It's an honor to be with the group here at Fairhaven. And as I'm here among you at your beautiful retirement center, I'm reminded that I spent probably the last 3 years of my life visiting my mother, who unfortunately left us at age 95 just last October. So it's just 1 year anniversary came. So I'd like to dedicate this to her. And she would love it when I would sit by her as she was in the retirement center and recite poetry about trees. And one she loved particularly was by Tennyson. Live thy life, young and old, like yon oak, bright in spring, living gold. Summer green, then autumn changed, sober-hued, gold again. All of her leaves fallen at length. Look, she stands, trunk in bough, naked strength. She lived like that, as if she was going to last forever, and she almost did. A remarkable woman. And she imparted in me as a child a love for the natural world, for those things around us which were the gifts that we had when we were born. They were already here. They were left by generations before, and hopefully we have the foresight and the willingness to make sure that they're left for the next generation also. My mom was a World War II Navy veteran. She was very proud of that. In fact, that's where she met my father. He was in the Philippines, and she was in a hospital in Bethesda, Maryland. And she was proud of that. She was proud of, again, what came before. Trees are remarkable in that they stand as obelisks in the landscape. They're reminders of those people who walked beneath them before. A 250-year-old tree, and you've got some of those here in Whitewater that are bicentennial oaks plus, are reminders of all the generations that came before, and also reminders of the fact that we are given just a brief moment in time to be able to make our contributions. These trees watch over us. They came much earlier than we did. They'll be here beyond us. And they, however, need to be taken care of. I would like to talk to you today about some of the things of interest to me particularly, and I'm thinking they might be of interest to you too. The wisdom that is held within trees comes in many different ways. I would like to talk about the meaning and measure of these trees. They're remarkable organisms. They've co-evolved with us as human beings. They're self-optimizing on a planet of gravity, wind, and decay. They can't come inside and escape that. They're always dealing with this, and they deal with it with great intelligence, remarkable intelligence. The science and measurement tools which I spend my life researching to be able to better understand how to identify when a tree might be ready to be removed because it's dangerous and might fall over. We'll talk a little bit about that as I progress with my story. Remarkable organisms. Who could not just find these great Sequoia sempervirens, the coastal redwoods, which stand for 2,000 years? Nobody planted those. Nobody waters them. They found a niche that exists only in a small part of Northern California. Unfortunately, when the European immigrants came in, they recognized them as a resource, didn't understand like we do now sustainability. All but 5% of the entire population of those grand trees were cut down in a short amount of time. But many remain, and we can look at those with great admiration and love. These trees grow to great heights. This photo was taken when the tallest one was thought to be 364. Now we know Stratospherus in Humboldt County is 395 feet tall, almost 40-story skyscraper, growing by itself year after year after year. They're the most massive organisms on Earth. And of course, for many generations, when they were first identified as the immigrants moved to the California area, we took great pride in their size and wanted to identify with them. Trees have remarkable beauty and artistry among them. All you have to do is just take a few moments to look at a root system, at a trunk, at the intricacy that exists inside a leaf, the canopy, multiple shapes. As I was walking in, I saw that great Pinus nigra, that Austrian pine that was growing right out by the front door here. I saw those red maples. I saw those beautiful red oaks with their intense fall color standing there, all with different shapes. Henry David Thoreau said, "It's not what you look at, it's what you see." I'm hoping that after a few minutes with you, if you don't already do it, and perhaps many of you already do, maybe you wouldn't be in this room if you didn't have a love and a passion for trees already. But maybe you'll take a look at trees a little differently the next time you see them. All around the world are these trees. Here in South Africa, the baobab tree in Limpopo province is a remarkable tree. It stands huge, wide, remarkable shape. Has been there for centuries. In Japan, the cedar in Yakushima, Japan, is held in great reverence. This cedar has been there again for over 1,000 years. In England, in Dorset County, is a great oak that's probably 500 or 600 years old, standing there even beyond the time of Henry VIII. Here in the United States, we are blessed with unbelievable resources in the trees. We have the bristlecone pine, Pinus longeva, the oldest organism on Earth, upwards of 5,000 years old. Think about that. If you go back to biblical times, 2,000 years ago, you go back to the age of Pericles, which is 450 BC, double that. And that's when these trees began to grow, still living, still gathering sunlight, still gathering carbon dioxide from the air, still taking water and nutrients from the ground, and growing there for us to go visit. If you haven't had a chance to see photos of these trees and maybe even take a chance to visit them someday, they are truly remarkable. They are near Bishop, California, near the Mojave Desert on the other side of Yosemite National Park. And you look at them and you say, my gosh, are they really alive? They have maybe just a small little tendril, a vascular system, still surviving, and all the old wood accumulated around it, but they are indeed still alive. They only have 6 weeks of growing season. They are at 14,000 feet elevation. They're growing in gravel, which is nothing but dolomitic limestone. And you wonder, how can anything grow there? And that's their secret. Their secret of longevity is to grow in a niche where they can't have any competition. And A.E. Douglas, who started the University of Arizona Lab for Tree Ring Research, dendrochronology, dendro trees, chronology, time, the study of time by looking at annual rings of trees. Every year, these trees in a temperate zone will lay down another annual ring. As you take an increment bore and pull out a sampling of that, you can count those rings, see how old it was, and you can see where you had a wide ring when you had good weather patterns, where you had a narrow ring when you had maybe a drought going on. And then of course you can go even further. You can do analysis of what's going on chemically within each of those rings to see perhaps there was more sunspots that particular year. And that's what A.E. Douglas was really interested in. He was an astronomer. He had his pet thesis that sunspot activity and solar flares would affect weather on Earth. And he thought he could prove that by studying annual rings. So he started this whole new area of dendrochronology. He sent Edmund Schulman out to the bristlecone pine area where there were some National Park Service people. Actually, it was not even the parks, it was just the land management. It hadn't become a park yet. And they said, well, gee, we're cutting some of these trees down to make fence posts and some cabins, and we're counting an unbelievable number of rings. So they contacted A.E. Douglas, and he sent Edmund Schulman out there. And Schulman looked at some of those annual rings and realized that the oldest one was 4,850 years old. Unbelievable aging. We, until that moment, had always thought that longevity in trees was a function of having the perfect environment, which these sequoias sempervirens, coastal redwoods, and great red trees grew in with perfect weather, perfect soil. But no, the secret to longevity was adversity, that somehow being deprived of all of those things for growth allowed these trees to grow much longer. They had to. If they wanted to survive, they had to be able to make sure they had a long enough time to be able to reproduce. Schulman published in 1957 in National Geographic, The World's Oldest Trees. And I remember that article. I was born in 1949, so I was 8 years old, 7 or 8 years old. My grandmother in Pontiac, Illinois, like many people, not only subscribed to National Geographic, she kept every single magazine up in that attic. So when I went to visit her, I would go upstairs and I would look at those magazines. And indeed, I saw the 1957 one. And sometimes there are moments in your life that are epiphanal moments, where you all of a sudden see something you didn't see before. It's like Saul on the road to Damascus, who became Paul. The scales fell from his eyes. He had his epiphanal moment. He saw something that he hadn't even recognized before. I think maybe that was a moment for me. Maybe that was the moment I decided somehow deep inside of me, in the mind of a 7 or 8 year old, that I would love to spend my life dealing with trees and maybe someday go to visit those trees. Well, the oldest one, as I say, that Edmund Schulman observed was 4,845 years old. And there was even an older one discovered in 1964 in the Wheeler Grove. And I'll tell you about that story because it's a strange, sad, and yet it has a happy ending at the end. Only more recently, in 2013, have they discovered a tree that indeed is 5,062. But That wasn't known at the time that a young graduate student from the University of North Carolina by the name of Curry went to this area because he was studying geology. And he thought if he could only figure out how old those trees were growing on this particular geological site, that maybe he could figure out how old that particular hillside was. And so he bought an increment bore. They were all shipped in from Sweden at that time. And he twisted it into the tree, and it got stuck. And he goes, oh my gosh, I've got to get back to complete my dissertation. My major professors are waiting for me. Great pressure. So he went to the land management people there in the Nevada Basin near Wheeler and said, do you mind if I cut this one down? You've got a lot of these all around here. And so I can count the rings because it's going to take 2 months to have that increment bore shipped from Sweden. And of course, you know, there weren't many people that knew about these trees. We didn't really fully appreciate what they were as a national treasure. So he said, okay, you can cut it down. And he did. He brought it back to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, counted the rings, 150 older than Methuselah. 150. He just cut down the oldest living organism on Earth. But he was a good scientist, and he published an article about it. And when that article was observed by the scientists and came back to those people in the Nevada area, the few people that knew these trees and loved these trees, and just like Shulman had named Methuselah, they named their trees also. They named the tree that he'd cut down Prometheus, the demigod that brought light and fire to humans, and was punished by the Olympic gods for doing that by being tethered to a tree where his liver was eaten by a buzzard throughout his life until later on he was released. So Prometheus represents to scientists light, intelligence, study, the knowledge that we have, that ability as human beings to be able to take a look at the world around them. Donald Curry, when I went out to the Bristlecone Pine National Forest in 2006, I was doing research on using CT scans of trees because I thought that was a great way to be able to look inside a tree and to be able to count those rings and not have to use increment bores. I'd hoped to interview Donald Curry, but unfortunately he died just a couple years before, the park ranger told me. You know, I talked to some people from the University of Arizona Tree Lab research who were doing work out there. Rex was one guy's name, and I said, you know, do you know anything about Donald Curry? I mean, I was fascinated by this story. What was it like when a 24-year-old cuts down the oldest living thing on Earth? What kind of feelings does he have? And he said, you know, it was awfully hard on him. He went on to get his PhD. He went and was a great professor at the University of Utah and made a huge difference in understanding of the Bonneville salt flats. You know, in the Mojave Desert, he made huge contributions. But whenever he gave a talk, there would always be somebody in the audience who would stand up and say, oh yeah, Dr. Curry, you're the man who cut down the oldest living tree on Earth. It haunted him. You know, I believe that when it's all said and done, and we're put to rest, and they engrave on our gravestone the year that we were born, the year that we died, that's common. The dash in the middle is our life. What have we done with that gift? Donald Curry, I think, redeemed himself. He made a huge mistake as a young person. It came back, and he worked hard to be able to impart to others an understanding of this beautiful planet that we're on. And yes, mistakes are made, but there is always the potential for redemption. He redeemed himself. That dash on his gravestone, I think, is a bright, shining star. So I was out there at the ancient Bristlecone Pine Forest, and of course, I'm a lover of trees. I have to attribute that to my mother, I guess. And I wanted to get a sample to bring back to the lab. And of course, I thought I was going to bring back a small little thing, but it just so happened that that winter before, an arson had come in and burned down the Edmund Schulman Visitor Center. And so one tree, they never cut down trees there. Again, these are, very few. These are national, international monuments. They had to cut it down, and when the park ranger said, you're going to bring it back to the Forest Products Lab where you do the research and do research on that, I've got 2 large sections. Would you like to bring those back? And of course, I couldn't wait to get those into my trunk and have UPS ship them back to the lab where we cleaned them up and brought them over to the Wisconsin Institute of Medical Research, which is where they have all these big 64-slice GE scanners. And if you've ever had a CT scan, they put you on a little conveyor belt there. They run you through, and they have these spinning sensors and x-rays that then are able to, by measuring the attenuation or the lessening of that x-ray passing through your body, measure the change in density, and then using an algorithm software be able to create a projection of what your internal organs look like. I wanted to do that with the tree. No one had ever done that with the bristlecone pine before in all of history. We didn't know what we were going to get into, so I brought some of my colleagues from the Forest Products Lab and some medical researchers at the University of Wisconsin, and we put that log in, and that's the fun of science. You conduct an experiment, you don't know what you're going to see. So we were all in the screening room, and of course, they never had any tree of any sort go through their scanner before. They were fascinated by this, and then the images started to come up. These were the images that were the inside of already almost 1,000-year-old bristlecone pine. Small, sub-millimeter size annual rings, and my x-ray was able to see them in such beautiful form. And because an x-ray is measuring things in a 3D fashion, I could go in any direction, not just that single axial direction that an increment board comes in, but I could see how things were growing. I created a video that would show, as we were moving along that longitudinal axis of that sample that I had in there, branches bursting out, changes occurring on that screen as if it was growing right before your very eyes. Unbelievable images. And there in the center were little white lines coming from that pith. Little white lines that, again, as we were moving up and down, tended to shoot out and retract, shoot out, as if they were starbursts coming up. And somebody turned to me in the lab, in the screening room, and said, Dr. Allison, what is that? And I spent a lot of my life studying trees. I had no idea what we were looking at. So I turned to Shiping Wang, one of my colleagues, very knowledgeable man, worldly traveler, had, again, studied, as an engineer would, and he said, Bruce, I don't know. So I took that sample into the wood anatomist at the USDA Forest Products Lab. This is the institution of the Forest Service that conducts the great research for all the forest and wood products in the United States. They are recipients of all kinds of questions from around the world about trees. They know everything. I showed it to Alex Wiedenhoff there, and he, very confident, he said, well, I'm sure I can figure this out. His eyes were like saucers. He couldn't figure it out. I got an email from him that night, and of course in an email you can see when somebody sends it. It was midnight. He couldn't sleep. This was a puzzle that was puzzling to him. He said, well, I figured it out. These are needle traces. Those were needles when that tree was just a little stem, little green needles that were coming out. But how could that be? He says, because on 5 needle pines, the needles only last 2, at most 3 years. Well, I'd done my research and gone back to the books. Bristlecone pine is the only tree that can hold on to its needles for 47 years. Remarkable. So now we have a new way to do dendrochronology, not just take a look at the increment bore sampling of the annual rings, but we can take a look at what was going on biotically at the moment that those needles were coming out. You know, what was the chemistry of the earth then? Was there more carbon dioxide, 1,000 years ago? What is this affecting in terms of climate change? So, trees are living organisms. They've co-evolved with us as mammals on this planet. The United Nations does studies, and they recognize that 2.4 billion people cook with wood as their fuel. We're dependent upon those particular trees. They are the lungs of the planet. They take in the carbon dioxide, which is what we expel after we've taken in the oxygen, which they in turn release to our planet to be able to breathe. They clean the air by taking the particulate matter out of the air, by the leaves acting as great filters. They hold the earth in place. We had terrible floods many years ago along the Mississippi River. And people thought, well, we must be building, not tall enough levees and whatever. But I knew, and people that studied ecology and trees knew, that the reason for that was we had cut down all of those forests which were surrounding those rivers, because when rain hits, the leaves and canopies of those trees intercept the rain, so it reduces the velocity. It holds it like a sponge up there, so it's slowly released into the earth, and it doesn't cause this real erosion and flooding that occurs. So trees have a huge impact on how we are able to enjoy our planet. And of course, they're a wonderful resource for building. We have many wooden things all around us. We're surrounded by wood. There is a certain affection that farmers particularly have for woods. This was the cover of a book that I wrote. This was the second edition now, called Wisconsin's Champion Trees. It's in Columbus. Two very proud dairy farmers who stood by their huge cottonwood tree that was over, 30 feet in circumference. There is a certain poetry about the shape of trees. Alfred Tennyson poem that I recited to start out, inspirational for people. People want to live their life like an oak. Chlorophyll and hemoglobin, well, yes, we've co-evolved. And I'm going to tell you something now that if you forget everything else that I say today, you'll probably remember this. Hemoglobin, or the hema molecule within hemoglobin in our body, is the same molecule as the chlorophyll, the green, inside that leaf, with one exception. In the center of chlorophyll is magnesium. In the center of the hema is iron. Magnesium, green, iron, red. We have co-evolved. We're connected in a wonderful way. When a tree is cut down unnecessarily, or when we plant a tree at the birth of a child or at a marriage and intertwine two saplings together, the reason we do this is because of our strong affection and almost a subconscious connection we have with those trees. It's true, trees and people really do need each other. Look at the great cypress, the Montezuma cypress called El Tule in Oaxaca, Mexico. All those children surrounding that love it. In Dodgeville, there was a man who took a picture of the same oak tree every day for a year. These are all the people that are connected to that tree, standing around it. Yes, a strong connection with that single oak tree. Just recently, in September, the question was asked, how many trees are there in the world? And so they used, which we didn't have 50 years ago, remote sensing, satellite imagery. And they were able to do ground truthing. That is, they went, once they had the big picture, to go in and actually count and do sampling so they could make a solid estimate. This was done through Yale University. And they came up with a number of 3.04 trillion trees. That's a lot of trees out there. And even more importantly, was trying to understand where the tree concentration was. 43% are tropical, 24% in that dense boreal area, which is further north, 22% of the temperate zones, which is where we essentially live right now. But notice that 43% in the tropical. I just came back from doing a workshop and a lecture with the Forest Products Lab people in Rio de Janeiro, and we flew over the Amazon. And of course, you read about the Amazon being cut down and its adverse effect on the planet in many ways. The plane left Atlanta, Madison to Atlanta, at the night, but we had about 2 hours, 3 hours of daylight before we landed, and we were flying over the Amazon. I looked down, and I did see, indeed, this verdant green carpet below me. And then as we got closer to civilization, there were more cut-out rectangular fields to be able to have pastures so they could have cattle in there. They're big meat eaters in Brazil, so they want more and more cattle, and they cut down the trees. And then I saw even worse, white plumes of smoke coming up as far as the eye could see from 40,000 feet elevation. They were burning the trees they had cut down, weren't even using them, burning them down, making fields. And the soil wasn't that good, so they weren't going to be able to last long. They would have to move on and cut down some more. And of course, once the trees are gone, the erosion starts. So we are making a negative difference. And that isn't just an issue for Brazil, because those 43% of tropical trees are influencing our climate up in North America. Good research has already established that. Trees are amazing. They are self-optimizing in a way that I wish I was self-optimizing. They are dealing with huge forces on Earth. Wood, which is called secondary xylem. Xylem is just the type of wood tissue that the tree is laying down every year. And of interest, that empirical studying of the natural world started with Galileo. He was, I shouldn't say started, fairly say, he pushed it forward into the enlightenment that we have right now. And he paid a dear price for it. Galileo, and again, note the years when he was living, 1564 to 1642, made a huge contribution by observing Venus. He had an early telescope and looked out at Venus and noticed that Venus, as a star, had phases like the moon. He, in a world where the church was the political force and the dominant force, didn't want to have that observation. They wanted a belief that somehow the earth was the center of the world and everything was rotating around us. Galileo said, no, that's not quite right, because Venus wouldn't have these phases if indeed it was rotating around us. Indeed, it's rotating around the sun, as are we, which was not to be easily said. And so he said it in Latin. Cynthia Figuris amolatur mater amorum. The loving mother, which is what everybody knew at that time to be Venus, imitates the configurations of Cynthia, the moon. That was a shocker to the world. Along come Isaac Newton. Note that Isaac Newton, 1642, was born the year that Galileo died. He carried on that work of trying to understand the world around him. And he came up with Newton's laws of motion that says inertia, that anything that's moving will continue to move unless a force is exerted on it. Anything that is still will continue to stay still unless a force is exerted on it. And that any change of momentum is proportional to the impulse that's put on it. Now let me give you an example. When you're driving the car and you got to slow on those brakes too quickly, you're going to keep moving forward even though that car has stopped there until you hit something that's going to then stop you. And reciprocal actions, that in order to have stability, you're going to have an equal and opposite force. That was an insight that made us better understand trees. If, for example, a tree was the mast of a sailing ship, it's pushed along by the wind. But it's not pushed along by the wind. Trees basically stand because they have the force of the gravity, the force of the weight of the root ball and the friction of the roots on the soil. So if that fails, then you have uprooting. And you can see from this picture, that's not a pleasant event for the tree, and certainly not a pleasant event for anybody who has to be nearby. One of the things that I've done is forensic research on trees. This is why I'm so interested in tree decay and what makes trees stand up. I was called in 2005 in Monona. There was a honey locust that one fine morning, when a line of traffic, people waiting to go to work, came crashing down, and it was not a happy ending for the driver of this particular car. There are a lot of mechanical stresses that work on a tree. Its own weight, there's wind, water, and lean, shearing forces as trees are twisted in the wind. And you don't need to know, I'm not going to test you afterwards, for the physics here, you don't know all these formulas, but just know that formulas are just simply a way for us to try to understand those forces that are always around us. I mean, right now, gravity is holding me back. Gravity is holding down this desk. Trying to understand that is pretty important. When things are bending, of interest is that, say that branch was leaning out and the force of gravity is bending down, why doesn't it just break? Well, one of the reasons it doesn't break is that trees are self-optimizing. They have the ability to lay down additional wood in those areas where they have additional mechanical stress. If I'm bending forward, my stomach cells are under compression. My back cells are like springs under tension. The same thing's happening to that branch. Now, my body is not laying down additional cells to be able to prop me up or to hold me back, but that tree's branches are. It senses, it reads its environment and tells one side to lay down additional wood, same number of annual rings, but one side is thicker to be able to act like a prop to hold it up or like springs to hold it back, countering gravitational forces. Is that wisdom? Is that wisdom in a way that is not so easily understood? Is it not necessarily the kind of wisdom that we might have in our thinking and whatever? But there is a wisdom going on there. And of course, one of the great enemies of trees, and we all have enemies in this world of one sort or the other, is decay. Here's an interesting picture that was sent to me by some friends at Monticello, which is Jefferson's home in Virginia. They had a great Liriodendra tulipifera, a tulip poplar tree growing there, and perhaps Jefferson planted this. And unknown to them for many, many years was the interior was slowly decaying. And of course, that decay works on some elements inside of that tree, loosening its order. And then when there's enough decay, if you have bending, the tree doesn't have the ability to sustain itself. It has to fall over. But a tree, again, even when there's decay entered, has a certain wisdom about it. We have used this acronym called CODIT, which is called compartmentalization of decay in trees. Think of a tree as being a great battleship. A torpedo strikes its side, opens up some of those areas that are full of air holding this ship up. The response is to close off all of those doors to be able to contain that area of damage. That's what trees do. If I imagine this to be a tree, was to make a wound on the outside because I hit it with my lawnmower or some vandal hit it with a hatchet, it has a wound there, and then suddenly all of those spores of saprophytic fungus, and saprophyte just means deadwood eating as opposed to parasite like oak wilt or Dutch elm disease, which are killing live trees. The interior part of a tree is all yesterday's newspaper. It's just dead wood. What you're doing is allowing that fungus to enter in, because the integument, the skin, the bark that is surrounding that tree to protect it has now had an opening. Just as if I were to cut my hand, I can now get bacteria into my body. I don't want that. And so my body has certain defenses. The tree also has certain defenses. It lays down compartments around to seal off that area of decay. So here we have a representation of what happens. That decay is moving into the tree, but is being sealed off so that the new wood laid down is going to be protected. Oops. I jumped ahead there. Now, that's all fine and good until along comes another scientist, Ilya Prigogine, who says, you can't understand complex systems just by taking a look at the parts. Because when a system gets so complex and there's so many parts, it takes on an organizational aspect of its own that is unexplained by the individual parts. Can anybody name an example of an emergent organization that we can't quite get our hands around? I know what you want to say. It's a political error now. Weather. Why is it we know the barometric pressure, we know, which way the winds are blowing, we know, where the jet stream is, but we can't very successfully predict the winter. It's an emergent system. It has an organization that is so complex that we can't understand it by knowing all the individual parts. Even the most complicated computers can't figure that out. So organization can acquire meaning and life of its own and begin to transcend the parts from which it is made. That's a remarkable fact. Well, science and measurements, nonetheless, even though it's an emergent system, and I can't necessarily predict when a tree is going to fall, because I'm asked all the time to take a look at somebody's tree in their backyard, which overhangs their house, and they say, I can't sleep at night because is this tree going to fall down or not? I have to have some tools to measure that. And so I go back to science. Just to make sure I don't overtalk my welcome here. I've got just about 15 more minutes. And so let me just, if I may, because I feel passion for this. My son was a physics major at the University of Wisconsin, which of course made me very happy. At the end of his sophomore year, he said, Dad, I don't want to be a physics major at UW. Music has always been my passion. He was first chair of violin in the high school orchestra and all university orchestra. I've applied for and been accepted at the Berklee College of Music in Boston. Would you support me in that change? I'm thinking, oh my gosh, we're going from $6,000 a year tuition to $36,000. We're going from a guaranteed job as a scientist to a musician and an artist. But I remembered when I went to my dad and I said, Dad, I've been accepted at 3 law schools. And he said, well, great, which one are you going to choose? And I said, Dad, I've spent the summer climbing trees with a tree service in Baltimore. I'm not going to go to law school. Trees are my passion. I'm going to spend my life in the trees. And he was a banker. I'm sure his eyes rolled, but he said, you've got to follow your passion, and I'm sure things will work out. So I had that memory clearly in my mind when I said to my son, well, I know you love music and you'll do well. Well, he's now 29, living in Portland, Oregon, and doing well. You have to have a passion for something if you really want to make a contribution, as is Donald Curry in the short time that we have here. Einstein said that there are those people who do not believe there are such things as miracles, and others like myself who believe that everything is a miracle. This whole concept of trying to understand the world around us has a history. Sir Isaac Newton said that when he was complimented on his work, he says, well, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants who have come before. We, as people who've been around for a while, understand that there are many people that we have launched in different directions, and we're proud of that. We're happy for that, and we want them to continue in the passions that we have. Robert Hooke was the one who came up with this concept. The truth is, the science of nature has already been too long made only a work of the brain and fancy. It's now high time that it should return to the plainness and soundness of observation on material and obvious things. Trees are those obvious things. The need to understand trees so that they don't fall at the wrong moment and hurt us, to be able to understand how they grow so we can promote them, because they are critical to the health and happiness of our environment. Robert Hooke, and again, they all love to do their studies and lectures in Latin. Utensio sic uus, as is the extension, so is the force. He was talking about springs. If you want to understand spring, the force that's exerted on that spring is going to determine the extension of that spring. Along comes a man by the name of Thomas Young, and all wood engineers know Young's modulus very well. And he said, well, to fully understand that, based on the work of earlier scientists, we want to understand wood. You know, I don't know that this happens to be wood, joists in here, but you've had houses and you go into buildings where you've got wood, which are joists on the floor to hold you up, and you want to make sure that somebody was pretty sure that that 2x10, with a 12-foot span was going to be enough to hold you up so it doesn't come crashing down, and we're able to understand that thanks to the work of Thomas Young, who said that measuring the flexibility of a tree, we measure its modulus of elasticity. Modulus is just the big word, it means change in elasticity. It's stress over strain. So if I put some pressure onto this wood, that is the stress, and the strain is the movement of that wood. We can measure that, and we can know comfortably that the engineering characteristics of that wood are going to be able to support our weight as we stand in that building. And then along comes Christian Huygens, who again was working on the work of others, and he was fascinated by sound waves. He tried to understand how waves were existing. And from all of that, we all of a sudden came up with a new relationship between the density of a material, the flexibility of the material, and its relationship to the sound wave moving through it. So I'm now working on a new invention, which I just got a patent for about a month ago, to be able to send sound waves through a tree using something called piezoelectric sensors, fascinating sensors that are surrounding you, you just didn't use that name for, that have a little crystal inside, so that when I hit that crystal, mechanical force is able to translate into electrical impulse. And so I put one on either side of the tree. I have a little stopwatch in the center. The wires are going down to it. And when I hit it, it starts, the stopwatch says start. That sound wave moves through the trunk, arrives at the other side in so many microseconds, which is 10 to the negative 6, goes back and says stop. And I look at that and I can read that and I can say how many microseconds it took to move across that piece of wood. If it has decay in it, it's going to take longer, because the density is different. It has to move around to get to that same spot. Bingo, we have a way now to be able to non-destructively take a look at that tree and determine if there's a big area of decay in it. And you get really fancy, you get multiple sensors going around, and you use the same thing they do in CT scans and create a projection to show a picture of what that might look like. And then we have other tools. This tool is called a micro drill resistance tool. I have a very, very small needle-like drill that's only 1.5 millimeters in diameter, going through to about 40 centimeters depth. And then I measure the torque resistance as it moves through. And I create a graph. And that graph, higher amplitude, higher lines, tells me that I'm hitting hardwood. When it drops down, I've got softwood, or in the case here at the very end, I've got nothing. So now I can very exactly quantify in a geographic way where I have decay. So I can tell you, yes, you've got 6 inches of remaining wood on this big oak tree, which is maybe enough, maybe not. Now, these things cost money, but honestly, can you put a price tag on a tree? Well, thank you very much for your patience. Wonderful talking to you. And I'd like to leave as a gift, thank you, Carrie. I'd like to leave as a gift to the Fairhaven's Retirement Center a couple of books I wrote, Wisconsin's Champion Trees, and this is Every Root and Anchor. And if you get a chance, read this because there are trees from Whitewater, Fort Atkinson, Milton, and other areas nearby, and maybe you'll have a chance to see them too. So again, thank you. I'll just leave these with Carrie.
Questions. If there's anyone who has a question or two, we can take them. Otherwise, you could speak to Dr. Allison after. Any questions? Okay, just 1 second here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I know that there's been a lot of attention paid to tree ring analysis in connection with episodes of drought in California. And I was wondering if there has been similar tree ring analysis to compare what was happening in other parts of what's now the United States during the time of heavy drought in California.
The answer is yes. I can't tell you what that research has discovered, but yes, that lab for tree ring research at University of Arizona, and if you were to Google that, I'm sure they would give you more articles than you could read in a week. But yes, that is of great interest. When I talked to Paul Shepard, who is one of the scientists at the Arizona Lab for Tree Ring Research, and he was very interested in what I was doing with the CT scan. He came out and he said, you know, this bristlecone pine is probably the most important tree in terms of the politics of the climate change issues. He's gone up to the Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. many, many times to be able to present his observations as a dendrochronologist. So yes, there are certainly other studies that are being done, and I just can't tell you what they are. Thank you. Oh.
This question relates to your phrase on the screen right now, can you put a price tag on a tree? I just wonder if you have an opinion or a comment about the trees that were recently taken down in the last few weeks on the corner of Main Street and Prince, two of the oldest oaks in the city of Whitewater. Oh, they were maples, okay. But in any event, do you have an opinion or a comment on that action?
Well, absolutely. I've spent my life, with the books that you are seeing, trying to bring attention to the value of trees, both culturally and also to the environment. And it doesn't mean that there aren't moments that, if a tree has significant decay, if there are some overriding reasons to be able to move on. My comment, more than anything else, and I feel, anguish when I see a great tree drop, period, and I do. But they're fungible commodities. They're recyclable. They can be planted again. And if we don't do that, then we're not going to have additional trees later on. For every tree that came down, 10 trees can be planted. 100 trees can be planted. And we need more trees, 3.04 trillion. But nonetheless, the rest of that story is that since development, human development in North America, for example, we have lost over 50% of the trees that were originally there. 50%. Now, foresters understand better that when you cut down a tree, you better be planting some additionals because it might be 80 or 100 years later, you're going to need that additional resource out there. So I think that, each case is different, and unfortunately, I really don't know any more than the fact that some some beautiful trees were lost, and it appropriately was very upsetting to many people. And political decisions are made, development decisions, economic decisions. That's the world we live in terms of that cultural milieu that we have right now. But that doesn't mean that we have to give up on doing all we can to force justifications for removal of critical trees. And it sounds like many people here did take that position.
We're going to have one more question here, and then again you can
This
stay
gentleman,
after.
Yes.
I'll talk to you afterwards.
How much water does it take to supply for one of these giant sequoias in California?
Well, it's interesting.
What does one consume, say, a day or a year?
Yeah,
What
well,
does it take?
as you can imagine, huge quantities. And of interest is that they have grown so tall, again, 40 stories tall, that it's beyond the capability of the capillary action and cohesion that's normally pulling the water up from the soil to get it up into the upper part of the crown. So they have, again, self-optimized. They've developed other strategies of gathering water from the air. When those fogs roll in the valley, and that's why they have a very limited growing area, they have to have just the right atmospheric conditions. They're gathering water for their photosynthesis through the mist in the air. Remarkable, but it's physically impossible for them to be able to pull that height up.
So I'm sorry we don't have any more time for questions as part of the program, but again, I do encourage you to stop up and talk to Dr. Allison if you would like. And Brian tells me that the 2 books that he's leaving will be in the library here in Fairhaven in the next several days or so. I personally have read the larger book that he held up, and it is fascinating. So if any of you have some of those feelings about the trees that were here in Whitewater, you'll read the book. It's so wonderful, and it'll make you feel wonderful for reading it. So please join me in thanking Dr. Arborist Allison. Thank you.